Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, good. So, welcome to our birthday party. I say birthday party because we're here to celebrate our double anniversary, which is 5 years of our Center for Institutional Studies and 10 years for LIA, which is Laboratory for Institutional Analysis of Economic Reform. And our idea to celebrate this birthday, not just with a party, but with a small conference. So thanks for coming. It's a real pleasure to see a lot of colleagues, friends, and those people who do projects with us, or probably will do projects with us. It's our great pleasure to have you all here, and we hope to spend our enjoyable and exciting day. That's a brand new room, and we are the first group to be here and to have a conference here. So I think we start very good tradition of interesting events. Just a few words about who we are and what is our history. We have short history, so it will take a long time. So we emerged 10 years ago as a small research and study lab. An idea was to create a lab which will be unique in the sense there will be no such labs in HEC anymore. And now there are about 25 other labs in HEC, so we're a good example how you can reproduce research groups. And during these 10 years, we always were the source of innovation because first research assistants in HEC emerged from our lab, first teaching assistants also emerged from our lab, and our lab was the first one to run the international summer school, which was 8 years ago. So this year we celebrate the 9th occasion of the Russian summer school for institutional analysis. So in this 10 years we have a lot of workshops, conferences, projects, papers, books, everything, and I hope we're going to tell about that a little bit in our presentations. So we don't want to overwhelm you with our papers and our projects. That's why we decided to divide our conference in 2 parts. First part will be our presentations. That will be plenary session. Professor Nine, Professor Polishuk, and me going to talk briefly about what our projects are. In the second part, we'll give the floor to you, our friends and collaborators, to present your papers and explain what you are doing. And I think it's a great opportunity to put our research in the general context of their institutional research. So 5 years ago in our lab, we decided that we need to grow a little bit, and we became the Center for Institutional Analysis, which includes 3 labs. And 4 years ago, we became the International Center, which means that we now have the international leader with Professor John Nye, and he'll talk a little bit about that. So I'll probably stop here and give the floor to my colleagues to give a presentations, and we'll start with Professor John Nye. John, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes. Уважаемые коллеги, дорогие друзья, good morning. When I was first introduced to Maria Yudkevich, she was actually my student at the summer workshop of the Von Coast Institute. Years later, she invited me to participate at a summer school in 2009, the Russian summer school. I believe I was the only lecturer in English at that summer school, and people were split into English and non-English sections afterwards. Since then, I have been asked to participate as an international advisor and co-researcher. Interestingly enough, I was asked to participate in a project in which I really have no competence, which will probably be revealed today. But Maria is a specialist in education and knows far more about it than I do. But I agreed to work with her on looking at the determinants of education. But in the course of this work, we became very interested in the important role of biology and background human capital in terms of what influences success and in trying to dig out results. Since then, we've had a variety of interesting research ideas, of which I'm going to emphasize one today. However, I'm also going to try to run through briefly the multiplicity of different projects I've been working on with this group. But I can sort of say, as part of the inaugural conference in 911, I hope that this time those numbers will be more fortuitous. So today I'm going to talk about the fact, does this work? Does it work? No. Always some technical thing. I never liked PowerPoint. There used to be a time when I would tell people, learn to give presentations without PowerPoint. Okay. So, human capital is one of the most popular and it's one of the most basic elements of a lot of economic analysis. Even the term itself is, I think, started out, not a joke, but in some sense it was unintended. You may not know the background, but it boiled down to the fact that economists talk about labor and capital, and many of the early scientists, particularly at MIT and Harvard, like Bob Solow, who wanted to emphasize how important their models of labor and capital are, wrote a famous paper with Arrow, Solow, Denison, I forget who the fourth co-author collaborator was, in which they basically showed that the capital labor model didn't explain much of US economic growth. And they had a huge residual. Later on, they added the idea of technical change and technical growth. And then they had the idea that, well, human capital is different. Labor, unskilled labor is different from skilled labor. And to symbolize the difference, they talk about human capital. But even when discussing human capital, people have a hard time talking about what it is, in particular how to measure it. The most common proxy is education. But in trying to understand what education does, we need to realize that education is driven by a variety of cognitive and non-cognitive factors. For instance, economists still debate today whether education is primarily signaling, that is, you don't learn anything from education, but it sorts you into able and less able people, versus to what extent education has value added in terms of the training that you actually learn, or the ideas or the mindset that you develop. Furthermore, when you think about what does it mean to be high-skilled or low-skilled individuals or more productive, then everything from their health, their nutritional environment, their IQ, their characteristics, all those things matter. So when we think about it, part of what we mean by human capital is a mix of biology plus learning plus environment, right? And that's a really complicated set of things. Now it turns out, if we look at what are the components of performance, both in education and in income, the largest single identifying characteristic in all the research worldwide is cognitive ability. The psychologists use the term G, laymen use the term IQ. It turns out G is used because G does better than any other single measured factor. Now, more recently there have been some studies in which non-IQ or non-cognitive factors affect performance, but part of the problem turns out to be how we measure non-cognitive factors. And here, psychologists do not have a unified measure. There are a variety of things like, for instance, Big Five, personality is common, but Big Five does not have a role for risk, even though risk is one of the most important parts of personality. Similarly, there are various other measures of personality dimensions that are discussed by other researchers like Howard Gardner, which don't fit into Big Five. And moreover, unlike G, most of the tests of personality are highly endogenous in the sense that even the person taking them can misrepresent what their personalities are. So it's a big problem. Nonetheless, non-cognitive factors are important. Heckman, writing with the psychologist Angela Duckworth, summarizes the growing importance of non-cognitive measures for market success. Heckman calls this character. So for instance, locus of control, Big Five, attitudes, risk-taking, time preferences, all of these affect achievement-like outcomes. But there's another problem. Even Heckman, who is probably the most rigorous researcher in this regard, tends to treat non-cognitive dimensions as either additive or subtractive. That is, he treats them as fundamentally monotonic. For instance, They treat something like conscientiousness, and they say, well, more conscientiousness is bad, more conscientiousness is good, less conscientiousness is bad. So if we're not measuring that, then we're overestimating the role of IQ. Or conversely, there might be other factors like neuroticism, which might be negative. However, there's good reason to believe that non-cognitive characteristics, unlike IQ, have nonlinear aspects. But there's very little measures of nonlinear aspects. And that's related to how bad the measures are. For instance, when I looked at the work of Heckman and Duckworth, it turns out a lot of their indices of personality are actually an aggregate index based on a series of 0-1 questions. There'll be things like, has someone been arrested by the age 20? Were they pregnant as teenagers? Do they smoke or drink? Have they committed a crime? So these are 0-1 measures, and it's a fairly arbitrary set of aggregates to get some correlation. You do not, in fact, have a continuous variable, which is objective, not easily gained, not easily influenced by life behavior, which correctly picks up some aspects of non-cognitive. So, part of what we do at HSC, or at least one of our big projects, is focusing on the role of prenatal testosterone. It turns out prenatal testosterone, which is the mix of how the shock of prenatal testosterone you receive in the mother's womb, combined with the way your body processes that prenatal testosterone, affects secondary sex characteristics and brain development and cognitive functions. Prenatal T has been correlated with many things. I'll just give you some examples in a bit. But it is also clearly sexually dimorphic. It affects boys and girls differently, and it develops around the same time that all sex-specific characteristics develop. Moreover, this dimorphism between boys and girls occurs in utero. 2D40 is affected by both genetics and prenatal environment, but does not vary systematically after birth. So our goal is to use systematic evidence in 2D40 in combination with standard measures of human capital to think about how they affect things. Just so you see, most of you already who know my work already know this, but basically it boils down to the fact that the longer your fourth finger is, the stronger the prenatal T. The shorter your fourth finger is relative to your second finger, the bigger the mix of estrogen relative to testosterone. For reasons I do not understand, medical people measure this as 2D40, which is the opposite. They should be doing 4D, 2D. So you need to understand that low digit ratios are high testosterone, and high digit ratios are low testosterone. Okay, so that's an example of someone with low 2D4D or high prenatal T, right? There's a ratio of 0.945. Most people's ratios are more in the order of 0.99 to 1. If you look at these two curves, males and females have similar overlapping but not identical. So the green curve is women, and the blue curve is men, and the red is the average. So you see there's a lot of overlap between them, but there's systematic differences. For instance, it turns out, for instance, on average, girls have higher prenatal T in terms of higher 2D4D than men. However, there's some studies, for instance, that show women in the Olympics tend to have fingers that basically have similar 2D4D to men. So that there's some evidence of things like that. To go quickly through this, to think about what are these mechanisms. 2D4D has been correlated with testosterone to estrogen levels in utero based on amniocentesis by a large team by Lutschmeier, Baron Cohen, etc. Moreover, digit effects have been seen in animals, such as pheasants or mice, which have also been affected by prenatal testosterone. I believe there's some recent studies of primates which get pretty much the same thing. And as I sort of said, this dimorphism occurs in utero. 2D40 matters because it's been correlated with a lot of things. Among the 100 or so papers that have been published on this, some of the most well-known are Manning was among the first, show that musical rank, how people stand within the orchestra, first violin versus second violin, is strongly correlated to 2D40 with people having higher prenatal T being higher rank on average. It's correlated with risky behavior. It's correlated with female aggressiveness. In many situations, the effects seem to be stronger for women than for men. It's correlated with occupational preferences, in particular with the work of Pessler and Sapienza, but as we discussed today, a recent paper by our group also shows these findings. Economists and psychologists working together at Cambridge showed that it relates to bond trading. Successful bond traders in London earning well over £100,000 a year have very low 2D40 traders. Those earning under £30,000 a year have much higher 2D40. And in our first published paper from the lab, we showed that comparing results from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and the University of the Philippines School of Economics in Manila, that there are effects, nonlinear effects for women, but not for men. That is, in some majors, women have this inverted U to the 4D. That is, it turns out there's an optimal prenatal T. If you have too much, one way you can think about it is that if you have too much prenatal T, maybe you're too risk of taking, or too aggressive, or too impatient. If you have too little, you don't have enough self-confidence. However, that work was criticized because we did it at two elite schools, HSE and UPSE. And elite schools have the problem that since you're selecting from the very top of the distribution, you may be removing most of the distribution. So since then, we've tried to look at something more detailed. So more recent work has been based upon the Russian social survey. And in fact, starting from a sample of over 6,000 people who agreed to have their fingers measured, we're able to get down to 2,500 working age adults in the Moscow region who agreed to have their finger sample, which is a very large, very varied sample. It turns out the Russian sample, like many samples in Russia, is skewed towards more women than men. That is not uncommon in Russian samples. Moreover, it gets down to about 1,700 once we throw out people whose fingers have suffered injuries and are broken, or who have a large amount of missing data on other questions. But at any rate, what we did is we studied 2D, 4D, and wages. For first, we ran this with standard Mincer controls. Now, the problem you have is that the standard economic equations control for things like experience and education. The problem is it may not be accurate to control for those if 2D, 4D also affects the likelihood of obtaining higher education. However, just to show you quickly, our work is robust to looking at the effect of 2D, 4D and wages with or without education controls. So for instance, just the strongest effects for the women, you'll see there's a nonlinear relation just in the straight 2D, 4D with no controls. You basically get this U-shaped curve. Women who are near the Moscow average of 1 have the highest wages. Women with very high or very low prenatal T have lower wages. Now, interestingly enough, the men have a similar shape, but it's not significant. If I have time, I'll talk about that as well. But it turns out, once you correct for age and age squared, which is the proxy for experience, and for education, those variables are significant, but the female variables on 2D, 4D still remain. So this is very important because it means it's very robust, even if we've already chopped off a large part of the effect of 2D, 4D. This is probably because 2D, 4D both has a linear and a nonlinear component. And the linear component is probably what's being removed by the education controls. And the nonlinear component is persistent. So we've shown this strong correlation for women. We have it, interestingly enough, much stronger for women than for men. For controlling for education is an underestimate of the effects because education is also affected. It's important to say we don't understand why these non-cognitive components matter. We don't know how much of it is because it affects your willingness, ability to study, how much of it is because of, say, cultural expectations about the way women should behave in the workforce or something of that sort. We don't understand that at the moment. But the main way to think about that is that lower 2D ratios are correlated both with higher nutrition and with greater testosterone. So the parts of it that are weakly correlated with higher nutrition are going to be correlated with things like higher IQ and greater health, and that's going to be monotonic. But the parts that are more directly related to personality are going to be nonlinear. Just to go quickly, we have a lot of ongoing research. We often find, so for the RMLS, for a large number of dependent variables, we find a huge number of effects that are for women, not men. Most of the women's effects are this inverted U. However, in some things like education, the men have similar coefficients, but not significant. However, when we try to make serious corrections for outliers, the men also become significant and nonlinear. In other related work, a paper with Katja Orell was published recently in 2015, in which we looked at career differences. We looked, other people like Manning and others had studied the effects of 2D, 4D in career, but all pre-existing work suffers from two biases. Either the measures of 2D, 4D were self-measured, or very often they were like non-random samples. They were like internet samples of people who want to take the test. Or in one other case, they don't look at actual occupation. They look at what people say they want to do. we looked at actual occupational data. Then we used the psychological classification of Holland in terms of different types of job, conventional, social, etc. And what did we find? Women in basically what psychologists call stereotypically masculine professions, that's not my word, that's theirs, like being a lawyer or a manager, have much higher prenatal T than women who are secretaries, janitors, lower level office workers, or cleaning ladies. We have other tentative RMLS findings, such as the fact that you get this on education, you get this for alcohol, you get this for even ownership of PC, you're going to get 2D4D effects, which match some of the literature. We are also beginning a collaboration with Julia Kovas of London to examine 2D4D for twins. Julia Kovas has a detailed set of 400 teenage twin pairs in 3 Russian cities. We will not only measure 2D4D, we will get gene typing, we will have all their family background, we will have all their high school test scores, we will have all their exams, we will give them an IQ test, we will take current testosterone, we will do a battery of psychological and physical tests on them. And we will have both fraternal and identical twins. So we will be able to separate some defects of the prenatal environment versus genetic effects directly. We also have a lot of work on 2D4D and market preferences, as well as education. We're not getting much effects on education. On preferences, what we're getting are effects from education. We're getting education seems to affect liberal preferences, but we'll get to that. On liberal preferences, we're going to compare our work with Miles Kimball of Michigan, who's published major papers on how studying different things affects liberal preferences. We have also just begun a new study on the persistence of elites. For those who don't know, there's the work of Greg Clark, who has a very well-known book called The Sun Also Rises, in which he looks at how elites persist in different countries around the world. In particular, he looks at the fact that he looks at rare aristocratic names and their representation in the US Ivy League. It turns out the percentage of names of people of rare aristocratic names in the Ivy League in 1900 is only a little bit higher than it is today, despite the huge changes. It turns out that finding is the same for China, pre and post-communism. It's the same for Sweden, and it's the same for the UK. We are now going to look at Moscow State, and our plan is to look at 3 groups. We're going to look at Russian elites, in particular successful families or well-known noble families. We're going to look at Jewish representation in Moscow State, and we're going to look at German names, because Germans were overwhelmingly higher class and concentrated in urban areas. We're going to look how persistent those are and see how that changes over time in Moscow State. The Jewish one is also interesting because there were claims about the extent to which, at first in the early 20s, there was a preference for Jews among the Bolsheviks. And then that disappeared in the Stalin period, in which there was discrimination against Jews. And supposedly that discrimination disappeared in the 90s. It would be nice to sort of see objectively what we can observe about the distribution of Jewish names in the admissions to Moscow State University over a century. So in conclusion, I have like 3 minutes left. We're doing a large number of interesting projects with a very large group of people. I cannot do justice to everybody. If I left you out, I'm sorry. You'll have a chance to show off your stuff later, but I really am very grateful to HSC and all the workers here. Maria and I are just sort of the top of the pyramid, but this work could not happen without all our assistants and collaborators at all levels. But we've shown that 2D4D, like the existing literature, is linked to many life outcomes. We know that it affects all existing estimates of these factors in the literature. If you ignore this, that means potentially all the economic, sociological, and political science data, looking at human capital, looking at income, to the extent they ignore the role of biology, might be either over or underestimating the effects of both income and education in terms of outcomes. We need to understand the trade-offs, especially where gender norms are significant. So it would be good to look at these effects in different cultural environments. We don't know a lot of things biologically, such as why sometimes it's significant for the left versus right. I'm starting to begin a collaboration with the psychological department here, in which we hope to look at brain mapping as well. The psychologists tell me that this has to do with the fact that prenatal T rewires the brain in utero and limits the pathways by which current testosterone can affect you. But nobody fully understands exactly why that is, and we know there are ways in which left brain and right brain function affects different types of success or different types of capacity. And as I sort of said, we don't understand cultural interactions. Just to reiterate, what is special about the HSE work? We have large samples with wide variation. Both our HSE student sample and the RMLS sample are among the largest objectively measured sample in all of the literature. We have detailed information about some groups, like students or like the RMLS. We are able to compare work with some other nations because of small projects I have going in the Philippines. We have the potential for twin studies. We have the ability to combine surveys with psychological studies and economics experiments. And I look forward to more collaboration with HSE and to all my friends around the world helping out in these projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. I think that we have several minutes for questions and comments. Yes, please.
Excuse me, I can't hear you, sir.
Yeah, there is a possibility of side effect. Let me start with some story. I had a neighbor who was a master of sport of volleyball. When we checked our strengths, I pressed about 90 kilos by right hand, and he could do it only 55 kilos. He was really surprised. He said, how is this possible? I said that I wrote 5 books at that time already. So if you measure this very ratio on the right hand, there might be this side effect that this well-educated people, due to the work of writing books or whatever, might change this ratio and it might go in a different ways with dependency.
Yes, very good question. But we've already dealt with that because we have measures of both right and left hand. We tend to remove people with injuries. Moreover, if you think about it, those things will be affected, but they will not systematically affect the ratio. That's the important thing. The issue is not whether it's affected, because all that will do is introduce noise. That will mean, if you have a lot of noise, we shouldn't get significant results at all. The fact that we're getting consistent, significant results means that there's something important with correlations here. Moreover, we have a lot of studies in which we do right hand, left hand, and the average of the two. So we've worked very hard to take care of these issues.
More questions? Yes, okay.
So, John, so there are 2 components that you list. I think is important, but I would like to comment on. So,
I can't hear you.
One thing is, genetics itself.
Right.
You mentioned about testosterone later in life and then the prenatal testosterone. So can you distinguish between the effect, whether it's later in life testosterone differences or this prenatal one? And second one is about genetics versus culture. If your prenatal testosterone depends on your parents. Maybe it's your environment, your interaction with parents later that affects your attitudes to life, to risk and other stuff rather than prenatal testosterone.
So let me answer those in the order you asked them. The first one is you need to understand a couple of things. Part of the reason we do on prenatal testosterone is that prenatal testosterone by definition doesn't affect you after birth. When people talk about testosterone, they're talking about circulating testosterone. But circulating testosterone varies over time. Older men have less circulating testosterone than younger men, but your testosterone can vary within hours. If you get very excited about something or want to work, your testosterone might spike, whereas other things can be done to lower your circulating testosterone. So this is very different. So basically, the idea of prenatal testosterone is that I'm very clear that it might be affected by environment, but it's not affected by environment after birth. That's the critical issue. So it's not affected by life experience. Whether you go to a good school or a bad school, whether you have bad nutrition or good nutrition as a child, that is not going to affect your prenatal T exposure. But whether your parents have good nutrition, that will affect your potential prenatal T. So that's relevant. As to genetics versus culture, sure, that's extremely problematic. And like I said, we're very far away from doing that. The first stage is not even to do that, just to worry about environment in the womb. Hence the twin study. Because now if we have fraternal twins who don't share, identical twins are monozygotic, whereas fraternal twins do not share the same right, the same egg, and so there are going to be much stronger genetic differences. But both the pairs of twins will have been raised in the same prenatal environment. So we are hoping we're able to tease out more about the pure genetic versus the environmental role when we look at that.
Only one more question. Yes, thank you.
Well, first of all, I find this fascinating, and I've heard from Maria about this study, but I guess I never really got involved with enough to understand. And now the question that I have probably arises from my layman understanding of the latest generations of children some of them are affected by the fact that mothers quite often became pregnant while taking birth control pills. And there have been several studies recently that show that if a woman continues to take birth control pills but she's not aware that she's pregnant, then some of the female hormones that she's injected into her body artificially could affect the child development. I have no idea whether this affects testosterone, and so my question is, would that be any potential control variable that should be taken into account, or is it something that's even relevant?
Well, it's not that. You're asking me to do something much, much harder now, which is try to say all of the ways in which prenatal are affected and then how that affects behavior. We're doing something much easier. We're just sort of saying, however the prenatal T effects show up, they're fixed once you're born, more or less. I mean, there's some talk about a few weeks or a few months after birth, the prenatal T, the finger ratio may change a little bit. But again, it's not clear it changes systematically. But for sure, after age 1, there's not an issue. But as to why, so for instance, if I observe a child has high TB4D, which means low testosterone, I don't know if it's because there was malnutrition, or the genes are different, or because the mother was on birth control pills. That's a separate kind of issue. I can tell you that I get strange reactions to this paper every time I go all around the world. I told Alex that I gave this at one school, and the first thing everybody did was he sort of said, somebody walked up to me and said, from now on, as soon as I go on a date, I'm going to shake the girl's hand first to check out the 2D40 ratio. But anyway, like I sort of said, I don't want to talk about those things. That's outside that's above my pay grade, as we say in English.
Thank you, Econ.